So today, for week 13, we're going to look at modernist art, which all date from about 1860 to 1965. This is the second to the last period of art in the course, and it's a very important period of change. I mean, it seems like change is just a part of everything we've studied so far, but we particularly see the rate of change increasing during this essentially a century of time. Note that there are two videos to watch, one as an introduction to Impressionism, another as a description of Van Gogh's painting of the self-portrait as a post-impressionist. So let's look at some of the features that were part of the rise of modernism, especially during this critical period of 1871 to 1914 in Europe. And so since so much of the art we're going to look at is from France, I'll focus a lot on France here. So between 1870 and 1871, there was a 10-month period where France comes apart and then finally establishes a republic, by which we mean a democratically elected government. So the last Napoleonic Empire is destroyed. France is plunged into a hopeless war with Prussia, which we think of as Germany today, at least part of Germany. Paris was besieged, and then finally there was a Paris Commune revolt, which was eventually suppressed by the new republic. So it's a period typified by nationalism and militarism, imperialism, and especially this colonization of other countries. And it'll play into the colonization that occurred in Tahiti by France, but certainly we see it in many European countries and from the United States as well. A couple of other big things. The growth of industrialization is occurring. This could be considered a second industrial revolution, especially in France and Germany, and you see it in the United States and in Great Britain. You see the growth of urbanization, meaning the concentration of people in urban centers. And that, for the United States, means there's an uptick in religious and ethnic diversity. So, for example, if you just think about our area in Northern California, you see the growth of the city center of San Francisco right after the gold rush in the middle part of the century. And then that brings, for example, Chinese immigrants and new Chinese religion. If you want to get a sense of it, you can visit the temple in Orville, the Chinese temple, which has Buddhist, Confucian elements. So there's an increasing sense of religious diversity. More Catholic Christians are coming in addition to Protestants. So there's a sense of urbanization and the mix that's occurring in our country. There's also a sense of the class battles, the emergence in the United States, the Gilded Age, which also has, in our country and other countries, a clash between the workers and the owners of capital. So the growth of capitalism, especially laissez-faire or free market capitalism, Marxism, that ties in with the challenges of social justice with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and of course Lenin as the beginning revolutionary in the Soviet Union. And then you have the challenges of science, especially biology, psychology, and physics. Darwin brings evolution with the origin of species in 1859. Sigmund Freud in the late 19th century brings his psychoanalysis in early 20th century. And then Bohr and Einstein bring new versions of the universe and new understandings of quantum reality, the subatomic world. Then you have the philosophers of suspicion and atheism. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. I'll note those in a moment again. But there's also, in the United States especially, a growth of optimism. The periodical The Christian Century begins around the turn of the century and has a sense that Christianity as an element of the religion and society of the West and of the United States is going to flourish into a new century of hope and optimism. And there's creativity like the laying of the transatlantic cable, the Eiffel Tower, and so on. But that comes to a cataclysmic close in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars. France and later the United States but before that, Britain and others battled Germany, the Habsburg Empire, and Turkey. And there's this cataclysmic sense of people using the greatest technologies, including, of course, mustard gas and chemical warfare to kill one another. And you can see in this next map how Europe changed between before World War I, the huge German and Austria-Hungarian empires, and then afterward a reassignment of those areas, and a new Europe formed, which, again, it changes after World War II to some degree, but looks a little bit more like what we experience today. World War I, as I said, was a watershed in European history and was great despair for European intellectuals. So there was a sense that if you had the right culture, which was often formed on the right religion, your culture would demonstrate growth and the right kind of values. And so, of course, the values that were broadly Christian, again, this way of thinking, developed the best in the greatest civilizations that produced these thinkers and these painters and all of this. And as I mentioned earlier, this came to a crashing close with World War I, and just the incredible amount of death in which trench warfare produced very little advance at any level. And I know there's all kinds of movies and books about this. Of course, the classic is All Quiet on the Western Front. I love the recent movie, the recolorization and vocalization of silent films by Peter Jackson called They Shall Not Grow Old. So, it's a really cataclysmic and important time. And so there's a sense during this period that claims to an objective world that's out there, which we can actually accurately perceived, a sense of what is knowable, an idea of truth with a capital T. The idea of beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder. A unified human morality even becomes very, very problematic. So this, for many, especially intellectuals, suggests that God is not a creator. So we learn from Darwin and others as well that humans developed. They weren't no species was created fixed in time. And this, by the way, the fixity of species was something that was held by almost all Western thinkers up until this period. Even Newton thought that the Earth was maybe about 6,000 years old. So the development of human beings not necessarily being different from animals, which was implied in Darwin's theory and then expressed in The Descent of Man in 1871. And of that, then, a God, or the one God who creates human beings, is no longer strictly necessary. We don't need this God to explain the world around us. Nietzsche declared that God is dead. And Nietzsche, as you can see, lived from 1844 to 1900, this son of a Lutheran pastor who found Christianity to be an embodiment of all that is really reprehensible and weak for him. And then the idea becomes that religion is just a psychological projection. And this is popularized by Freud, that God is an illusion. In other words, we want this God to be out there to take care of us, this father figure, but that's an illusion which creates neuroses. Beginning of early anthropology, especially around Columbia University in the United States, is one of the key places for this. There's no shared standard of beauty, questioning of a standard ethics or morality. And then in physics, the idea that popularly arises through relativity theory and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is there's no such thing as a truth or a privileged perspective. Of course, you see Einstein to the left and Werner Heisenberg to the right, and then in between them, to the left of Nietzsche, as we look at this, is Karl Marx. To his right is Charles Darwin, next to Bohr. Anyway, so Heisenberg said that you cannot, when you look at subatomic particles, know both the position and the momentum at the same time. So it's not like seeing a car drive down the street where you can see where the car is and where it's placed and where it's going. If you look at its a quantum entity like a photon, you can't see both with absolute clarity and absolute precision. That's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. There's a certain uncertainty in the quantum world. And Einstein, in his theory of relativity, demonstrated that time dilates depending on the speed at which the object is moving. And as you get closer to the speed of light, time makes extraordinary changes. Light bends around gravity and so on. So although Einstein called this invariance theory because what was especially special relativity, that light was the constant and everything that was invariable, the idea of relativity theory stuck, and this made people think that there is a great relativity to the world from physics. So final result. And you can see Soren Kierkegaard, whom we're studying this week. Again, Nietzsche next to him. T.S. Eliot, we'll look at his poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and then Picasso, whom we'll look at later all the way to the right. There's a subjectivity, so not an objectivity. You're not looking at an object, you're thinking, what does that subject see? Subjectivity and truth, beauty, morality. We are alienated from ourselves and the world, and we become subjective in how we think about the world, how we perceive the world, and that's put into art and music, etc. So there's a focus here on what the impression is of the object on us, which is played out in Impressionism. And partly, oddly enough, this starts with the development of photography. And here are two pictures of Abraham Lincoln from 1860 and 1864, which are currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's one of our memory assignments. How do you understand? So what's the best way to undermine the painted image? So there formerly, it was, in other words, the painted image used to be realistic and dispassionate and connected to the person in the photo. But photos are doing that work so much better now. So there's a playing with what is, the real. So they're inaugurated, these new trends, and solidified by the French Impressionists of the 1870s. But it goes back to this original work by Monet, Edvard Monet, in 1863, called The Luncheon on the Grass, which is now at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And I'm just flipping through a book to get to a Monet description. The book is called Dictionary of Art and Artists in the Penguin Library. Edvard Monet, 1832 to 1883. His well-to-do bourgeois father reluctantly allowed him to study under Couture in 1850 to 1856. He then reacted very strongly against the academic history painting of his teacher and began his career as an artistic rebel. He had a brilliant technique founded on the opposition of light and shadow with as little halftone as possible. So here you have The Luncheon on the Grass, which was seen as scandalous. You have this woman nude talking to clothed men. I mean, honestly, I wonder how we would think of this today if this was not a vestige or an example of the ill effects of patriarchy. But it certainly was seen as negative in that day. It was the exhibition of rejects, the Salon de Refusés. It was outside of the juried exhibition from the Paris Salon, and then became this movement which we know as Impressionism. Here we see Edvard Monet again with Olympia. He's this bridge artist between the realists, you might say, of the, like Millet's Gleaners from the 1860s, and the soon to emerge Impressionists. And now, if you hear pages turning, I'm looking at some of the commentary in the book Culture and Ideas, of course, which you can also, take a look at. I've sent you that link. But there's a sense with Monet of, undoing and discrediting the salon. So in this picture from painting from 1863, He was basing this idea on sketches he made outdoors, but he also then painted models in his studio. And his major contribution, I said, was to discredit the academic salon and to disestablish and create individuality for painters. And if you think about what he's doing here, it reflects back to Titian or Tiziano, but it's modern. It's not a goddess as in Titian, but it's a different look. And most importantly, the distance between viewer and the object is established and it changes the nature of the composition. So see how you look at those and compare them as to what is happening in the way that Monet is reworking a female nude. All right, let's continue with Auguste Renoir, another one of the great painters. Here's Le Moulin à la Galette. Moulin is the windmill. You might know it from the movie Moulin Rouge. He is doing also work with Impressionism. You're seeing the deconstruction of the fine brushwork of earlier artists, looking at these small patches of color, sunlight and light coming through, and then you come to the key impressionist, at least as we understand Impressionism, Claude Monet. This is Impressionism Sunrise. And you get this idea of the subjective here. The subject is perceiving the object. The idea of realism in a new sense, realism of everyday life, painted plein air or open air, meaning is not in a studio, but it was the new use of watercolor, and which dries more quickly than oil paint. You can see this is the broken air, the color, the shimmering effect. And part of this came out of the study of optics of the time, that it was really an interest to see how the eye actually viewed the world around us. It was said of Monet that by Paul Cezanne that he called him, quote, only an eye, but my God, what an eye, end of quote. So Monet recorded all the colors he saw, and he reflected them and tried to blend them together. He was preoccupied, as Culture and Ideas says, with the effects of light and color. And they create this kind of shimmering effect. And you can see that in the next painting. But before I get there, I want to say he reduces the depth of the canvas. It's a little bit more two-dimensional almost. And the subjects change. There's more social classes, ages, and individuals, like children, dancers, and even prostitutes that happen in this period. So you can see the water lilies to the right with the ever-changing appearances. These are actually, as opposed to what I said earlier, often these paintings are small. Here, this is quite a large painting, and I've seen some of the water lilies at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So you get this sense, more of the impression of the art on you. That's, I think, what's most important in this shift in painting. Then we come to Renoir, Luncheon on the Boating Party. Renoir, another impressionist put into this school. So Renoir shared Monet's interest in all this reproduction of light and color, but brought to his subject a human interest and sort of joy of life. Here there's a boating party of people enjoying themselves. I'll read again from Culture and Values. It's a refreshing change that Renoir brings, to find an artist here whose work consistently explored the beauty of the world around him rather than the great problems of human existence. Neither was Renoir's interest limited, as was Monet's, to the wonders of nature. So there's a sense of, the humanity, interest in humanity, the interest in just the beauty of life. Moving on to some female artists this time, Mary Cassatt. You have Breakfast in Bed and the Boating Party, and you can see her working with these same themes of everyday life, almost like a snapshot, you might think, but also not following the same conventions as everybody else. And whenever we see like a school put together, a school of Impressionists, it's always good to think, well, did they really fit together? Monet, for example, was not particularly interested in being associated with the other people that later were called Impressionists. Here we get to a new form of post-Impressionism with Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Yacht, I think it is, on the Seine. And here it's a pointillist, pointing with the paint to create a new way of thinking about light, how it's perceived, and how it is expressed on the canvas. So I'm going to get you a few close-ups of that because you can see it more closely. It's almost like a pixelated way of doing painting, and something we would be much more familiar with today with digital representations. So the question to ask is, what gives the viewed color its color when it's composed of colors that you don't see? So how can you get color, go back to the painting, if you can find those pieces, like the man to the right here, right? You see the colors that are actually there, and now when you look at the piece as a whole, the colors appear differently when all those blend together. It's fascinating. Let's look then at how scenes were then depicted. The post-impressionist transition goes into forms of abstraction, which is a precursor to a form called cubism. And one of the major players in the shift is Paul Cezanne, who's one of the first abstract painters. So he takes this Mount Sainte-Victoire, painted in different ways, and he gives up representation as he plays with abstraction. It's almost like the brush marks are a prism that gives you a sense to look into what he's seeing. So it's a new way of looking at things. This is, again, from the late 19th century, late 1800s. Here he is with some still life pieces. And, still lifes were huge in the Renaissance era to show incredible artistic technique. And here it's done to show technique, but not for the sense of, does this look exactly like the human hand, but does this look like how we perceive the human hand? Truth is subjectivity, right? All right, let's move on to Paul Gauguin. This is what is called early primitivism. Let me just say Gauguin is receiving some deconstruction, but let's see if we can both see what he is saying he's doing and how he's being received today. So this is where do we come from, where are we going? Again, almost the end of the 1800s. This idea of early primitivism, as it's called, will be picked up by Picasso and others. It builds on the colonial expansion, especially in this case, French expansion in Tahiti, as a certain cultural mixing, a newfound fascination with pre-Renaissance and non-Western indigenous art. There's flat shapes. There's non-secular themes like myths and dreams and religion. And in this case, the life of Maori or Polynesian mythology. So let's look at this painting one more time. It's a kind of a faux fresco, a false fresco. Gauguin is meditating on the sacred fire of primitivism, and even kind of a salvation, you might say, for Tahiti. So at the time, actually Gauguin he left his house, his family in Paris, his bourgeois life, and he moved to Tahiti to find this exotic world there. And it's funny, actually, many of the people that Gauguin would encounter actually wore Western clothing due to the influence of French Christian missionaries. So people weren't walking around topless all the time like he's presenting them. So that's really fascinating. And this is what makes Gauguin a somewhat controversial figure today. Also notice he pays attention to the mahu, the gender role that refers to people who exhibit both masculine and feminine traits. That's at the center of this piece. So Gauguin is a fascinating, both artist but representative of the way that people were viewing their integration of the understanding of other cultures, but really from a fairly imperialist and colonial perspective, and even an idealized perspective. Here's one more. This is what's called the Loss of Virginity. This may have as its subject Gauguin's Tahitian wife. So let me move right to that. Here is The Spirit of the Dead Watching. This is a portrait of Gauguin's Tahitian wife. And this can be interpreted many ways as misogyny, as a packaging of black bodies for European consumption. It's worth noting that Gauguin's Tahitian wife was 13 when they were married, and that was after he had left Paris and his wife back in France. So, as I said, lots of challenging and even problematic elements to Gauguin's work. And it also shows what was going on in culture and art of the time. Let's move then to Van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, certainly one of my favorite artists for the way he brings his troubled and active mind right to his work. This is another post-impressionist movement, and in many ways exactly the opposite of what Impressionism is after. This is Expressionism. Early Expressionism was not an attempt to put on canvas what the mind and the eye were feeling or sense what they were seeing, but to expose on canvas what the self and the mind and soul are experiencing, and to communicate those emotions, feelings, and orientations to the world. So it's what are we having inside, and to throw those onto the canvas, to express them. So look how the texture, the palette, and the objects get thrown together at the observer. Van Gogh's self-portrait in 1887 to the left, and his self-portrait to the right. Van Gogh, I used to live in New York City. We were members of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we'd look at the Van Gogh paintings, especially when my kids were little. I'd show them how thick his paint was. He used so much paint, it's like thick. It actually has its own texture to it to get that swirling kind of effect. Here you see the Café Terrace at night and the night Café on Place Lamartine. Again, these aren't supposed to be realistic. They're supposed to express what he's feeling inside. I think that's most shown here in his famous Starry Night, which is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It doesn't really look like a photographic representation of a starry night. It looks like the experience of a mind that's somewhat tortured and very active. As you know, Van Gogh ultimately committed suicide and never sold probably more than one painting in his entire life, even though his paintings today collect millions and millions of dollars. Here's Edvard Munch, The Scream. This is such a characteristic painting of this time, and this is more the side of the psychological horrors of modernity. Somehow summarizes that in just a very almost iconic way. 1893. It is in the Munch Museum in Oslo, Norway. Here we see something from Amadeo Modigliani, the nude couché, the nude resting or sleeping or lying, So Modigliani was known for portraits and nudes in a modern style characterized by elongation of faces, necks, and this is not in your screen, but in figures. But it was not well received during his lifetime. So there you have just another version of what's going on in this modern period. We're moving into the early 1900s. And then probably the most characteristic artist, which we'll focus on as the last section here, the great Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, who was born in 1881 and lived till 1973. He's great in part because he was so prolific, and his art spans so much of different movements in art, and also shows transitions between different schools. His life, in many ways, defines modernism. As you can see, again, his different self-portraits. Here's one more sense of those. A few different self-portraits, a few of the same, from age 18 to 25 to 90. So Picasso, this is from 1907. These are the Les Demoiselles D'avignon. He's moving closer to an abstraction. He's using elements of so-called primitivism and the geometric forms of cubism and even pre-Roman Spanish art from the 4th century before the Common Era, and he abandons the classical space of the canvas with multiple angles simultaneously on the same object. So it's almost like you're seeing all around the object. And this is presented, well, first of all, you can see just a bit more of Picasso and how he moves around the canvas, the person in the canvas. And then Braque, one of Picasso's colleagues, moves particularly into abstraction. So there's the attempt to get not just the one angle on an object, but all the angles at once in Cubism. And this is this is not Braque, but this is Picasso influenced by Braque. La Pointe de la Cité, the point of the city, in 1911, and then Still Life on a Piano in 1911. So you can see that the object is splayed out on the canvas, trying to see all angles at once. Kind of a God's eye view, you might say, which, in my opinion, did not succeed because of its incredible, reach, you might say? Yeah. Here's Three Musicians from 1921, another famous Picasso piece, deconstructing the human form, no longer at all going for realism. You can see this is a little bit of the anxiety that's happening in this period of post-World War I. People are feeling like we are being broken down into our component parts, not really looking human anymore to one another. Here's again Picasso, 1922, Two Women Running on a Beach. 1937, On the Beach, much less realistic. And then 1961, you see almost cartoon-like Picasso creating these images flat on the canvas, not really even attempting any kind of three-dimensionality at all. So with Picasso, we're moving into really modern art and the end of modern art, where I would say we're moving into postmodern art. This is a final piece from 1972, Self-Portrait Facing Death. So there you have it, a bit of an overview of modern art, especially from early modern art to the middle part of the 20th century. And all this move to subjectivity, all this move to questioning of values and questioning of what art itself is and what truth it represents.